The mountain mist clung to the time-worn stone steps of the monastery like an old veil. In the stillness of the morning, a 12-year-old boy knelt, the chill from the stones seeping into his bare feet, numbing them. He remained motionless, not daring to look up as the senior monk approached. The sound of silk robes brushing against the wooden floor echoed in the quiet, each step deliberate. The monk's gaze, one the boy had long since learned to avoid, swept over him, not with warmth, but with a cold, calculated observation, like someone evaluating an object they had claimed. When a weathered hand finally rested on his shoulder, it felt less like a blessing and more like the settling weight of a new life being thrust upon him. This marked his first dawn as a chigo, a temple boy. In that moment, his childhood was given up to fulfill unspoken desires, unknown in his small, frightened world. The air in the prayer hall was dense with incense, but it couldn't mask the palpable scent of fear that seemed to emanate from him. In the dim shadows between the towering, silent Buddha statues, other boys moved with eerie precision, their steps soundless. Some had been there for months, others for years. Their eyes carried stories he wasn't yet ready to understand, stories of what transpired when the temple bells ceased and the world outside chose to forget their existence.
In medieval Japan, there was a hidden world where beauty held great value, and youth, unfortunately, was often taken advantage of. In this world, the boundaries between sacred practices and harsh realities blurred, leaving behind only the echoes of those caught in this complex system. The story of the Chigo is not just one of personal suffering. It represents a long-standing system deeply embedded in society, designed to shape young lives. This was not random cruelty, but a tradition woven through the fabric of Japanese culture, from the quiet Buddhist temples to the samurai estates and the pleasure quarters of Edo. At the Koyasan monastery, dawn would signal another day of preparation. Boys as young as 10 were being shaped for a life they couldn't fully understand. Their hair was cut and styled in a way that highlighted their youth, and they wore fine robes that set them apart from other workers in the temple. But these robes, though beautiful, symbolized a life of restriction. The institution of the Chigo first took root during the Heian period. These young boys were chosen not for their religious devotion or intellectual promise, but for one primary characteristic: their physical appearance. Families, often struggling with financial hardship or hoping for social advantage, would send their sons to the monasteries. Officially, the promise was one of education and spiritual guidance, but the reality was far more complicated. Temple records across Japan reveal a well-organized method of recruitment. Monks would travel to villages during times of famine or economic hardship, offering to take in young boys, with compensation provided to the family. Some parents genuinely believed they were providing their sons with an opportunity for advancement, while others understood the full nature of the arrangement, but had little choice but to accept. Once inside the temple, the transformation began immediately. An older monk, known as a nushi or spiritual guide, would begin the process of preparing the boy for his new life, one where ritual and ceremony masked deeper and more painful truths. In the remote mountain monasteries of medieval Japan, the practice of nanshoku, or the male colors, became widespread. To the outside world, it appeared to be a sacred bond between teacher and student. But hidden beneath this veneer was a much darker reality, a deeply ingrained system that used religious ritual as a cover for exploitation. The daily life of a Chigo was carefully structured, with every moment designed for service and submission. Their days began well before sunrise, fulfilling the needs of their spiritual guide, the nushi, preparing his bath, arranging his robes and serving his meals. They were taught to move with quiet grace, speak only when allowed, and anticipate their master's needs before he even asked. Every action was carefully observed, and corrections were constantly made. What began as spiritual guidance gradually transformed into something much more invasive. Acts that were initially disguised as part of their training took on more troubling dimensions. Over time, complex philosophical justifications were created to rationalize these acts, with some monks manipulating Buddhist teachings to argue that a close bond between a man and a boy could lead to spiritual enlightenment. The noble ideals of compassion were twisted to serve this distorted belief. Within the archives of ancient monasteries such as Enryakuji on Mount Hiei, there exist medieval manuscripts that refer obliquely to the experiences of the Chigo. These documents, often written with euphemistic language, hint at the darker reality,
when compared with personal diaries that have survived the centuries. One 12th century diary, for instance, records the systematic instruction of a young boy named Kikumaru, detailing how spiritual teachings were used to progressively intensify personal demands. The geographical isolation of these temples made escape nearly impossible. Separated from their families and familiar world, these boys had no understanding of the harm being inflicted on them. Instead, they were led to believe that their suffering was sacred, that their obedience was a form of ascetic discipline that would lead to spiritual reward in future lives.
The psychological conditioning was often even more harmful than the physical actions themselves. The monks wove their exploitation into complex rituals, turning harmful acts into part of a supposed sacred tradition. Seasonal festivals were held to publicly honor the relationship between the Nushi and Chigo, where the entire temple community took part in performances that highlighted a boy's beauty, devotion, and subjugation. Though rare, some resistance did occur. Hidden ledgers of punishment from the temples reveal the harsh realities faced by those who defied their masters. Boys who resisted were subjected to starvation, confinement in dark cells, or severe flogging. Some were left permanently scarred, serving as grim examples to others. These records describe punishments with disturbing detachment: days without food, strikes from bamboo canes, and spiritual corrections intended to enforce compliance. Perhaps the most tragic aspect was how some Chigo internalized their abuse. Records from the temple mention boys who began to compete for their abusers' favor, performing increasingly degrading acts to gain status. They learned to betray their peers, becoming participants in the very system that victimized them. The institution didn't just exploit these children, it taught them to turn on each other. As the Chigo reached adolescence, their role within the system began to diminish. Their voices changed, their bodies matured, and the androgynous beauty that had been so highly valued by their masters started to fade. Some were allowed to remain in the temple as junior monks, though they carried with them the emotional and physical scars of their past. Others were cast out, discarded into a world that had changed, without resources or support. The fortunate few might find themselves taken into the samurai class, where the tradition of nanshoku had adapted to the warrior culture. In these warrior households, now called wakashu, the boys served a similar function to their temple counterparts. However, here, the spiritual pretenses were removed, replaced by the direct and harsh realities of a warrior's world. Outside the temple walls, this system of exploitation found new roots in the heart of warrior society. In the samurai castles of feudal Japan, the wakashu, youths typically aged 12 to 16, entered what was publicly recognized as honorable apprenticeship, but which privately had a much darker purpose. Officially, these boys were trained under veteran warriors to learn the sacred Bushido code, martial strategy, and swordsmanship. In truth, they became the property of their masters, serving as another possession in a samurai's world. The selection process for these boys was often driven by cold practicality. Samurai would acquire these youths through purchase from families suffering from poverty or those seeking political favor, treating the acquisition of a human life with the same ruthless calculation as buying a horse or a new sword. Historical accounts from the Kamakura era are striking. Correspondence between feudal lords describes the qualities of their wakashu with the same language used to evaluate fine weaponry. One surviving document details a trade where the warrior, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, exchanged 2 well-trained youths for a prized horse. The record coolly notes the boy's proficiency in both service and the delicate arts of courtly interactions. The training of a wakashu was a dual and harsh experience. Their days were spent mastering the sword and bow, while their nights were dedicated to learning submission. This combination of martial skill and coerced behavior created a form of psychological control, breaking down the boy's sense of self and remaking him as an extension of his master's will. Those who excelled in both areas became coveted status symbols, sometimes lent to allied samurai as tokens of goodwill, their bodies serving as currency in political alliances. The famous war chronicle, The Tale of the Heike, contains subtle references to this practice. It speaks of young attendants serving their lords in all matters, a euphemism that, with historical context is understood to mean both on the battlefield and in personal service. Their duty became a paradox, prepared to lay down their lives in combat and surrender their autonomy in private. The emotional toll of this life is revealed in rare personal accounts. A secret diary written by a wakashu named Taira no Shigemori, discovered centuries later in an old estate, recounts years of what he described as training. His writings describe being forced to prove his loyalty through increasingly demeaning acts, competing with other boys for small signs of approval, and learning to suppress every instinct of disgust and shame. The samurai class institutionalized this treatment with solemn ceremony. The brotherhood contracts, formalizing these relationships, were public affairs, witnessed and blessed by Shinto priests. These documents, cloaked in the language of honor and duty, laid out the youth's obligations. In exchange, the master pledged to offer guidance in the warrior's path. The most unsettling clauses outlined punishments for disobedience, ranging from severe physical scars to execution, framed as the rightful price for breaking a sacred vow. Samurai legal codes, such as the Goseibai Shikimoku, classified a wakashu's resistance as desertion, a crime punishable by death. The competitive nature of the warrior elite permeated this aspect of ownership. Lords would display their boys at formal events, showcasing their beauty and trained talents. Special contests were organized where the wakashu demonstrated both their martial abilities and their learned roles, their performance directly reflecting their master's prestige and influence. The winners of these intense challenges received brief privileges, while the losers faced harsh punishments that left lasting marks. Some wakashu, driven to their limits, sought refuge by converting to Buddhism or attempting desperate escapes to distant provinces. However, temple records reveal a harsh truth. Many runaways were captured by monks and returned to their masters, treated not as fleeing souls but as stolen property. Local authorities, whose power often relied on the support of samurai clans, would typically send escapees back, often after administering their own severe penalties for the disruption caused. The few wakashu who survived this ordeal without visible scars, both physical and mental, occasionally ascended to become samurai themselves. However, these survivors carried invisible wounds. Historical records suggest that many of these men, in a tragic cycle, later acquired their own wakashu, thus continuing the cycle of abuse that had broken their youth. As Japan entered the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, the practice of male concubinage evolved further, moving from the private chambers of the elite to the public marketplaces of growing cities. The rigid social structure of the Tokugawa shogunate created new avenues for exploitation, and young men found themselves commodified on a much larger scale. The great urban centers, Edo, modern Tokyo, Osaka and Kyoto, became bustling hubs for displaced samurai, wealthy merchants and impoverished families. This convergence created a powerful mix, a high demand for entertainment and a vulnerable population to cater to it. Rather than eliminating these practices, the government chose to regulate and tax them, effectively turning human suffering into a source of state revenue. Male entertainers of this era, known as kagema, shadow players, lived in the margins of society. They served both as performers and companions, straddling the line between respectable society and the criminal underworld. Unlike the temple chigo or samurai wakashu, who were bound to a single master, the kagema operated in a commercial sphere, where their services were available to anyone who could afford them. The rise of licensed pleasure districts, like the famous Yoshiwara in Edo, marked a new chapter in this institutionalized exploitation. While these districts are often romanticized for their female courtesans, they also contained thousands of male entertainers, serving a diverse clientele. The government's licensing system provided a veneer of legality, ensuring that a portion of the profits from this trade flowed into the state's coffers. The recruitment of young males into Edo period urban establishments followed patterns deeply embedded in Japan's socio-economic fabric. During times of agricultural failure or excessive taxation, intermediaries known as zeigen would approach rural households with offers that appeared to provide opportunities for young sons. These arrangements, formalized through contracts, promised training in cultural arts,
but typically created long-term obligations that were difficult to terminate. Surviving business records from entertainment districts reveal the commercial nature of these transactions. The acquisition costs for young male workers could represent significant investments for establishment owners, leading to complex accounting practices where expenses for maintenance, training, and equipment were meticulously recorded against future earnings. This financial structure often created circumstances that made departure from the profession challenging. The working environment for these youths was carefully curated. Specialized establishments developed distinctive aesthetics in their living quarters, incorporating specific color schemes, artistic decorations, and atmospheric elements designed to create particular impressions on visitors. Every aspect of the physical space was intentionally arranged to support the establishment's commercial objectives. New entrants underwent comprehensive training programs directed by experienced members of the community. This education encompassed various performance arts, social etiquette, communication techniques, and personal presentation. The curriculum emphasized developing the ability to understand and respond to subtle social cues, a skill considered essential for professional success within the entertainment districts of early modern Japan.
The clientele who frequented these kagema houses were drawn from various layers of Edo's society. Wealthy merchants, constrained by social codes from keeping permanent male companions, visited these places for discreet meetings. Samurai, whose incomes had diminished in a shifting economy, could now rent companionship that they could no longer afford to own. Even Buddhist monks, bound by vows of celibacy, were regular visitors at establishments where young boys, whose beauty resembled the chigo of their own temples, were available. The most unsettling insights come from the rare few who managed to escape. One such testimony, recently uncovered by historians, is from a man named Konoike, who worked as a kagema in Osaka during the 1680s. He recounts a world dominated by fear, the terror of violent patrons, the constant threat of disease, the anxiety of growing too old to remain desirable, and the harsh punishments for those who dared refuse a client or attempt to escape. His writings tell of boys who preferred death to further servitude, and others who were beaten fatally by clients, their bodies swiftly removed and replaced. The lives of these young men were treated with appalling disregard. The physical toll on these boys was devastating. Without proper medical care, they were highly susceptible to the sexually transmitted diseases of the era. Many suffered internal injuries from violent encounters that never healed. Malnutrition was widespread, as brothel owners often prioritized spending on silks and cosmetics that increased a boy's market value rather than providing adequate nutrition. Perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. Similar to the manipulation in temples and samurai estates, these boys were conditioned to believe that their suffering was part of a noble duty. They were told their beauty was a divine gift that they were obliged to share, and that providing pleasure was a sacred responsibility. Some internalized these false narratives, taking a twisted pride in their ability to endure such humiliation. For the few who did manage to escape, society offered no refuge. Their families, often desperate and having sold them into servitude, could not take them back. With no skills beyond those learned in the brothels, and carrying the burden of disease and emotional scars, they became permanent outcasts. Many had no choice but to return to the life they had known. Some, the successful few, eventually became brothel owners themselves, but this ascent came at a significant moral cost. They became the very architects of the same system that had shattered their youth, often becoming the most ruthless exploiters of the next generation. While late Edo period government records indicate some attempts to regulate the treatment of kagema, these reforms were largely superficial. The state's primary interest lay in maintaining the tax revenue generated by the pleasure quarters, rather than in protecting the lives of the young men trapped within. When severe abuses were uncovered, the typical response was to relocate the offending brothel owner to another district, a minimal consequence that did little to stop the ongoing cycle of exploitation. This grim reality lurked beneath the romanticized veneer of Japan's floating world, a system that was poised to be exposed to a global audience as Japan opened its borders in the 1850s. When Japan opened its borders in the 1850s, foreign observers provided an outside perspective on this hidden world. Their accounts, while influenced by their own cultural views, revealed the stark realities of the systemic exploitation. A British diplomat, Algernon Mitford, documented his visits to Edo's entertainment districts and expressed astonishment at the institutionalized nature of the trade, which he found far more blatant than anything he had encountered in Europe. As Japan moved toward modernization during the Meiji Restoration, 1868 to 1912, these long-standing systems of exploitation began to diminish, not because of a moral awakening, but as a result of international pressure. The newly formed government, keen on shaping a civilized image for the country, passed laws against the most overt forms of child exploitation. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often driven more by concerns over Japan's international image than a genuine commitment to protecting the vulnerable. The true tragedy lies in the patterns preserved across temple scrolls, samurai letters, and brothel ledgers. This was not just a series of isolated crimes, but a set of interconnected institutions designed to turn human suffering into tools for spiritual authority, military loyalty, or financial gain. The physical torment was only one layer of the harm. The psychological impact, the deliberate erosion of a child's ability to trust, the cultivation of profound shame, and the systematic crushing of self-worth left wounds that lasted a lifetime. Many survivors carried these invisible burdens until the end of their lives.
The most profound consequence of these historical structures was their cyclical nature. Those subjected to these systems often internalized their dynamics, perpetuating patterns of authority and submission across generations. This created a self-replicating social phenomenon that persisted for centuries, with each era inheriting and transmitting complex power relationships. Historical archives nevertheless reveal instances of individual agency amid systemic constraints. While documented cases were limited and consequences severe, these moments demonstrate the persistent human capacity for autonomous action. Some temple attendants sought to alter their circumstances through various means. Others in warrior households developed covert communication channels. Urban entertainers sometimes established mutual support systems. These organized efforts, however limited in scale, represented significant assertions of personal will within tightly controlled environments. The psychological awakening that preceded such resistance often began with subtle realizations. Consider a hypothetical scenario in a 12th century monastic setting. A young attendant, through chance discovery of administrative documents, might encounter records detailing the practical arrangements behind his placement. Such correspondence could reveal the economic considerations involved in his situation, or outline methodological approaches to integration and training within the community. This conceptual breakthrough would fundamentally reshape the individual's understanding of their position. The spiritual framework they had accepted might suddenly appear as an intricate social structure, where relationships they believed were based on devotion were in fact part of broader institutional practices. This cognitive shift, from accepting prescribed roles to recognizing systemic mechanisms, often marked the beginning of critical awareness and potential resistance, raising profound questions about agency within predetermined social roles. But it was the final parchment that transformed Yoshimaru's despair into a dangerous, fragile hope. Penned by a former temple boy who had escaped and taken the name Shinran, it spoke of a secret brotherhood of survivors. "I have found others like us," it read, "men who endured what we endure. We share knowledge, which monasteries to avoid, which masters are most cruel. We cannot erase the past, but we can shield others from the same fate." This letter was different. It wasn't just a testimony. It was a manual for rebellion. It contained coded phrases to identify allies, locations of safe houses beyond the temple walls, and intricate methods for forging travel passes that could grant Ichigo a new identity. Yoshimaru committed every word to memory, his heart pounding with a new, terrifying purpose. That night, listening to his Nushi's snores, he began to plan not just an escape, but an uprising. If a network of resistance existed, then the monastery's power was not unshakable. His first task was to find allies. This was a perilous undertaking. Many boys, broken by years of psychological manipulation, would report any whisper of dissent. Yoshimaru began with subtle hints and carefully worded questions, watching for the slightest flicker of defiance in another's eyes. He found his first true accomplice in Kenjiro, a boy whose master had recently died,
leaving him adrift and filled with a well-hidden rage. When Yoshimaru revealed his discovery, Kenjiro's response was immediate and fierce. "Tell me what we must do." Over the following months, they built a cell of 6 boys, aged 11 to 15, bound by a sacred oath of silence. They communicated through a language of glances and predetermined gestures, passing messages during chores and meeting only under the cover of profound darkness. Their initial acts of defiance were small but potent. They introduced mild herbs into the monks' meals, nothing lethal, but enough to cause discomfort, souring tea and unsettling stomachs. These were acts of psychological warfare, designed to seed unease among their oppressors.
For the boys, the effect was transformative. For the first time, they were not merely victims, they became agents of their own fate. This reclaimed agency, however small, began to mend their shattered sense of self. Emboldened, they leveraged the intelligence from Shinran's letters to reach the outside network. This required cunning, fabricating reasons to run errands to neighboring temples, covertly learning to read and write, and bribing sympathetic servants to carry messages. Their perseverance paid off when they connected with the Muko Kai, the society facing the sunset. This was a group of former temple boys, now established as merchants, who had dedicated their freedom to helping others escape. They were living proof that a life after the temple was possible, and they held the key to turning a secret rebellion into a real escape. Taking their name from the Buddhist ideal of reaching the Western Pure Land, the Muko Kai saw their mission as a form of earthly salvation, guiding souls from suffering into a new life. They had perfected a sophisticated system for extracting temple boys from their gilded cages. Posing as traveling merchants or devout pilgrims, their agents would infiltrate temple grounds, make contact with potential escapees, and engineer clever diversions. A staged commotion, a small fire, to provide a critical window for disappearance. A chain of safe houses along remote mountain paths offered shelter, while a network of sympathetic contacts provided new identities and honest work. Yet this underground network had its limits. It could only assist those who had already made contact and possessed the unwavering courage to risk everything. Many temple boys, psychologically broken or convinced of their sacred duty, were beyond reach. Others lived under such constant surveillance that any attempt at escape was impossible. For Yoshimaru and his group, connecting with the Muko Kai was a revelation that came with a sobering reality check. They learned of the grim fate that awaited those who were caught. Recaptured boys weren't just punished, they were made permanent examples, suffering severe consequences or left to perish in a world that had no place for them. Despite the overwhelming fear, the very possibility of freedom changed everything within the monastery's walls. The conspirators began a quiet campaign, identifying other boys who might be ready and gathering vital intelligence on guard patterns and seasonal shifts that could aid their escape. The plan they devised was bold and daring. Rather than a few individuals slipping away, they aimed to orchestrate a mass exodus, nearly 15 boys, all trustworthy in their resolve. This was not just about saving lives, it was about making a statement that the monastery could not ignore. The night of the Autumn Moon Festival was chosen. With the monks preoccupied by festivities, Muko Kai operatives were positioned at key points. They had forged papers, secured money, and arranged commoners' clothing. The network was prepared to act. However, even the most meticulously planned schemes are vulnerable to human weakness. Just 2 days before the planned escape, a 13-year-old named Tadanobu, gripped by fear or perhaps misplaced loyalty, revealed everything to his master. He disclosed the entire plot, the network, and the carefully laid plans for the mass escape. Retribution was swift and unforgiving. Yoshimaru was awakened in the dead of night by temple guards, bound and gagged. One by one, his fellow conspirators were dragged from their rooms and paraded before the entire community in the main hall. What followed was a chilling display of control, designed to instill fear and maintain dominance. The head abbot, whose outward persona was that of a gentle spiritual leader, oversaw the proceedings with cold efficiency. As the ringleader, Yoshimaru was singled out for punishment. The ordeal began not with a swift execution, but with the slow, methodical infliction of pain. Each finger on Yoshimaru's hands was crushed, the sound of breaking bones echoing through the hall.
This painful act was a clear message to the other boys. Defiance would come at a steep price. The purpose was clear. The hands that had written secret letters and orchestrated the rebellion were broken to prevent them from ever being used in rebellion again. Kenjiro, the recruiter of the group, was silenced in a cruel way, as hot needles were used to pierce his tongue. The younger conspirators were marked with permanent scars on their forearms, signs that would identify them as rebels and make any future escape attempts impossible. However, the physical punishment was only the beginning. The true nature of the temple's control was psychological. The boys were forced into a grotesque public display of repentance, where they had to confess their supposed sins, beg for forgiveness, and praise the monastery for sparing their lives. This redemption ritual turned them into living symbols of their oppression. Yoshimaru, now with damaged hands, was tasked with indoctrinating new arrivals. He had to sit with frightened young boys and use his own failed attempt at rebellion as a cautionary tale, explaining why submission was the only path to enlightenment. Each time he comforted a crying child and guided them towards acceptance, a part of his spirit withered. The temple had succeeded in its ultimate goal. It had turned the revolutionary into a tool of the system he had fought to dismantle. But even in this overwhelming defeat, sparks of resistance remained. The Mukokai network did not collapse, it adapted. The lessons from the failed escape were analyzed, leading to more rigorous processes, better security measures, and refined strategies to detect informants. More importantly, Yoshimaru's story did not fade away. It spread through whispers and hidden messages to other monasteries, transforming into a legend. What had begun as a tale of failure was now remembered as one of incredible bravery, a reminder that defiance was possible, no matter how overwhelming the system seemed.
Months later, deep within the mountains of the Kii Peninsula, the legend of Yoshimaru was reignited. At the Kumano Hongu Taisha, a young Chigo named Jiro, who had spent 3 years in servitude, began to form his own secret network. Having learned from Yoshimaru's tragic fate, he devised a more calculated approach. His group was structured in such a way that no single member knew the full extent of the plan, minimizing the risk of betrayal. Jiro's philosophy was more radical than anything Yoshimaru had envisioned. "They've taught us to see ourselves as nothing," he confided to his followers in the dark confines of a storage room. "They've trained us to be grateful for our suffering. But they also taught us to move like shadows, anticipating their needs and understanding their weaknesses. We will use the very skills they've taught us to turn the tables on them." His plan was not simply to escape, but to strike from within. Instead of a mass exodus, he proposed a targeted campaign of retaliation, making the most ruthless monks pay for their actions. These attacks would be disguised as accidents, intended to undermine the illusion of invincibility the monks held over the Chigo. The goal was clear: to make the oppressors realize that their prey had begun to fight back. The first target was chosen with careful precision. Brother Nishin, a monk infamous for his cruelty, even among his peers. He was known for inventing brutal punishments for the slightest offenses, leaving several Chigo with permanent injuries. He had no shame in boasting about his abusive behavior. The weapon of choice was poison, specifically a toxin derived from the deathcap mushroom, which grew in the woods surrounding the monastery. Jiro had learned about its properties from a former Chigo who had secretly returned to share this dangerous knowledge. When mixed with Nishin's morning tea, the poison was undetectable, and its effects would mimic the symptoms of a sudden, severe illness. Carrying out the plan required meticulous preparation. Over the course of many months, the conspirators trained the boy who served Nishin's tea to switch the cups without a trace of emotion. Others gathered the mushrooms during foraging duties, carefully distilled the extract in secret, and crafted solid alibis to ensure their plan would not be traced back to them.
When Nishin ultimately succumbed to what appeared to be a sudden stomach illness, the consequences were immediate and profound. A wave of paranoia spread among the monks. They became suspicious of their food and increasingly wary of the silent boys who served them. What had once been a carefully controlled environment now shifted to one marked by nervous vigilance. But with this small victory came a heavy price. The monks began altering their routines, testing their meals, and tightening security. The temple authorities imposed even stricter controls on the boys, making their already limited lives feel even more confined. Jiro now faced the age-old question of resistance. Had his act of defiance truly helped those he sought to protect, or had it only worsened their situation? The group was divided. Some believed they needed to escalate the campaign, using terror to force change. Others thought that the added repression was simply punishing the innocent. However, their debate was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected development. A government inspector arrived to audit the temple's finances. This sudden scrutiny forced the abbots to care more about their public image. For a brief moment, the treatment of the Chigo improved, offering a temporary respite from the usual brutality. Seeing this as an opportunity, Jiro shifted his focus. Rather than continuing with violent acts, he decided to focus on gathering undeniable evidence of the systematic abuse. His goal was to get this proof into the hands of external authorities, in the hope that real, institutional change might be possible. This new mission required different skills. Jiro had to learn how to write, understand legal frameworks, and gather physical proof that would be credible to outsiders. Most importantly, he needed to establish a secure line of communication to the outside world, making sure that his evidence wouldn't be intercepted. The work was slow, dangerous, and would ultimately determine whether the truth could break the silence that had prevailed for so long.
Every piece of evidence had to be hidden in a different location. Each damning record was carefully secured, hidden in places such as floorboards, roof thatching, or even buried in the garden. Establishing contact with the outside world was akin to a military operation, with messages being passed through trusted travelers or left at prearranged locations. Jiro had essentially begun constructing an intelligence network from within the confines of his prison, using only the limited resources he could gather. The breakthrough came when he made contact with a unique group, former samurai who had taken monastic vows later in life. These men, still possessing influence with provincial officials, were deeply moved by the evidence Jiro presented. Their social standing lent the accusations credibility that Jiro, as a temple boy, could never have achieved on his own. The dossier Jiro ultimately compiled was the result of months of secret work. It contained detailed records of specific abuses with dates and names, financial records showing payments made to families for their sons, copies of correspondence between monks about their activities, physical evidence of injuries sustained during spiritual training, and most importantly, first-hand testimonies from boys who risked everything to describe their suffering. Written in the straightforward, clear language of children, these accounts conveyed a raw, emotional depth that official documents could never replicate. When this evidence reached provincial authorities, it sparked an unprecedented reaction. For the first time, the government initiated official investigations into the systematic exploitation within the monastery system. While the resulting changes were modest, such as the removal of some particularly abusive monks and the introduction of new oversight measures, they marked a pivotal shift. The monastery's once unquestioned power was now being challenged. The effect rippled across the hidden networks that connected temple boys throughout Japan. Jiro's methods of documentation became a new model for resistance, offering hope for systemic change rather than just individual escape. In monasteries from Mount Koya to Dewa Sanzan, boys began keeping secret records, developing complex codes, and creating multiple copies of evidence to ensure that the truth would survive, even if they were discovered. The temple authorities responded with countermeasures of their own: random searches, heightened surveillance, and rewards for informants. What followed was a shadow conflict, fought with hidden documents and secret messages instead of open confrontation. Some resistance groups combined documentation with strategic disruption. At the great monastic complex of Mount Hiei, a boy named Kansuke developed a dual approach. His followers became adept at subtly disturbing the operations, accidentally damaging important manuscripts, introducing errors into official correspondence, and causing scheduling conflicts that disrupted the monastery's functions. Their aim was twofold: to gather evidence while simultaneously weakening the system from within, proving that even the most powerless could become agents of change when they organized and documented the truth.
The chains of tradition are not easily broken. For centuries, the silent suffering of the Chigo within Japan's mountain monasteries was an unspoken reality, a dark undercurrent beneath a veneer of spirituality. But this is not a story about those chains. This is the story of how they were shattered, not by kings or armies, but by the very boys they were meant to bind, and the extraordinary society they built from the ashes of their trauma. What began in the shadows of temple halls, a whispered conversation, a hidden letter, a shared glance of understanding, slowly coalesced into a force that would reshape history. The first, desperate acts of resistance, like Yoshimaru's ill-fated rebellion, proved a crucial truth. The system was not invincible. It could be challenged. Though that initial uprising was crushed with horrific brutality, its story refused to die. Carried by whispers along secret networks, it became a legend, a seed of defiance planted in the hearts of other boys in other monasteries. This seed sprouted in different forms. Jiro, at Mount Hiei, understood that brute force was not the only weapon. He masterminded a campaign of meticulous documentation, creating a secret dossier of abuse so detailed and damning that when it reached government officials, it forced the first ever official investigations into the monastery's inner workings. This was a paradigm shift. For the first time, the suffering of the Chigo was not a spiritual matter, but a criminal one. Simultaneously, a parallel strategy emerged, not just to escape the system, but to build a new one outside its walls. The most successful innovation of the resistance was the creation of survivor communities. These were not just hiding places, they were alternative families and functioning economic enterprises. In the port city of Sakai, a former Chigo named Dogen established a thriving trading company that doubled as a secret hub for the resistance. His ships carried coded messages, his warehouses sheltered escapees, and his business provided them with legitimate skills and identities. For the first time, escape did not mean a life of starvation and anonymity, but a path to dignity and purpose.
This network of safe houses, trading posts, and artisan workshops grew into a formidable underground movement. It evolved from simply rescuing boys to offering a comprehensive support system, legal assistance, medical care for those affected, and education in trades. This network, known as the Restoration Fellowship, gradually began to influence the very fabric of Japanese society. Its members became the doctors, teachers, merchants, and even government officials of tomorrow, creating a powerful and invisible web of protection for the vulnerable. Their ultimate act of symbolic victory was the acquisition of the Riverside Monastery. Once a symbol of cruelty, this institution was transformed into the Fellowship's flagship training center and school. The very stones that had once witnessed profound suffering now echoed with the sounds of learning and healing. Here, a new educational philosophy emerged, one that nurtured potential instead of exploiting vulnerability, staffed by those who had first-hand experience with trauma. The Fellowship's work became proactive rather than reactive. They began identifying impoverished families at risk of selling their sons, offering them alternatives and community support to prevent exploitation before it could occur. Their efforts shifted from treating the symptoms to addressing the root causes of the problem. By the dawn of the 13th century, the change was undeniable. The Kamakura shogunate, influenced by the Fellowship's relentless advocacy, introduced the first regulations governing the treatment of temple boys. While the laws were far from perfect, they marked a monumental shift, acknowledging that the state had a responsibility to protect children, even from religious institutions. The story of the Chigo resistance serves as a powerful lesson in the dynamics of social change. It shows that true transformation rarely comes through a single, sweeping revolution. Instead, it's a gradual and determined process built on countless small acts of courage. It is forged through the perseverance of the documenter, the creativity of the networker, the empathy of the healer, and the unwavering strength of the survivor. The men of the Restoration Fellowship, gathered at their first formal congress, were living proof of this. They were no longer defined by their painful past, but by their commitment to creating a brighter future. While they hadn't erased their suffering, they had transformed it into a source of strength. The temple bells, once symbols of their oppression, now rang as a tribute to their unbreakable spirit. They made sure that the silent cry of a frightened boy on cold stone steps would forever be met with a powerful collective response. The era of quiet suffering had come to an end, replaced by a new era of hope and resilience. This is the forgotten history of how the most vulnerable found their strength, and in doing so, compelled an entire society to face its own moral responsibility.
It's a story that demonstrates that the most powerful weapon against injustice is not a sword but a united community, and that when the human spirit stands together, it is truly unyielding.
The story you've just heard is one of resilience, unity, and the unbreakable human spirit. It proves that even the most vulnerable, when united, can create real change. The courage to stand against systems of injustice has always come from the brave few. And now it's up to all of us to honor their fight and continue their legacy. If this story moved you, imagine how many more forgotten histories need to be shared. Like, share and comment to help spread the message. Because when we unite through our stories, we spark real change. Subscribe to stay connected with powerful narratives like this. Together, we can bring the past to light and make sure it's never forgotten. Your voice, your action, can help keep these stories alive. Join us, and let's make sure the truth always finds a way to be heard.